Thank you all for joining our session on the last day to discuss climate change as a threat to global health and human rights. We recognize that humanity now faces an unprecedented shift due to anthropogenic climate change, with this changing climate posing a cataclysmic threat for global health and human rights. In facing this unprecedented challenge, it's a privilege to welcome you this morning, to provide an overview of the issue that we're addressing today, to introduce our inspiring panelists, and to moderate the conversation that follows. Good morning. My name is Benjamin Meyer. There we go. And I'm a professor of global health policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a senior scholar at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law, the past chair of the Global Health Law Consortium that put forward this proposal, and a researcher at the intersection of global health and human rights. In bringing together work at the intersection of global health and climate justice, our session today will consider how the inequitable health threats of climate change pose sweeping implications for health-related human rights, and how we can look to human rights to advance climate change mitigation and adaptation policies throughout the world. In today's discussion, I'm inspired to be joined by leaders who are looking at human rights as a means to respond to the existential threats of climate change and global health. And these panelists will speak to you over the next 90 minutes to frame the rapidly evolving state of global discourse on health and human rights and climate change, examining the need for One Health perspectives, the expansion of the field to encompass planetary health, and the imperative for global justice to advance health and human rights in the climate crisis. With the climate crisis posing an unprecedented challenge to global health, the impacts of climate change will undermine underlying determinants of health at the global level, especially among vulnerable populations, and threaten a range of interconnected human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water, and sanitation. This will take place for individuals and communities throughout the world. And in supporting the advancement of human rights in the climate change response, I'll begin by briefly examining the Earth's changing climate and discussing the rise of international policy to respond to this evolving threat. With human rights shaping international environmental policy from the 1970s through the Paris Climate Agreement, I'll then analyze these human rights impacts as a basis to implement climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. And finally, in seeking a path forward for humanity, I'll end this introduction by considering new challenges and new areas of focus, including the emerging implementation of human rights in international litigation, and as a foundation for the fields of both One Health and planetary health. Human rights can provide a powerful catalyst for action to mitigate and adapt to the greatest threat in global health. And I'm grateful to CUGH for providing this platform on the last day to bring together climate change, global health, and human rights, and to share the ways in which these evolving interconnections across fields can support the next generation to win the battles that we could not. We begin by recognizing that our Earth is hanging in the balance. While humanity has long experienced and adapted to shifts in the Earth's climate, our global industrialization has driven unprecedented anthropogenic climate change. And beginning in the 20th century, we've seen the Earth's average surface temperature increasing dramatically. Many have already concluded that the Earth has reached a distinct geological epoch, the Anthropocene, as a result of the profound impact of human activities on the Earth's ecosystems that is causing temperatures to rise rapidly. The Earth has now experienced over 50 consecutive years above the 20th century average, with these industrial forces leading to deforestation, air and water pollution, the burning of fossil fuels, of coal, oil, natural gas, and the resulting emissions of excess levels of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide and methane. These greenhouse gas emissions are trapping heat in the environment and leading to climate change. And given our inability to limit increases to 1.5 degrees centigrade, or even 2 degrees, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has concluded that temperature increases will have a significant impact on our climate system, upon which the entire world depends. This will pose profound implications for global health, as has been discussed over the past few days of this conference, with the global health impacts of climate change intertwined with a wide array of human rights, with human rights infringements resulting from rising temperatures and extreme weather events, from reduced air quality, new infectious disease threats from rising pathogens, food degradation, and limited water and sanitation. With growing understanding of these environmental health implications for all of humanity, governments have increasingly sought to come together to respond to these global environmental challenges through a series of international legal agreements to reduce climate emissions and protect human rights. While international agreements long neglected our global environmental challenges, it's the 1972 UN Conference on Human Environment and the resulting Stockholm Declaration that provided the first articulation of human rights in international environmental law, finding that there is a fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. Efforts in the ensuing decades would seek to interpret this right to a safe, clean, and healthy environment under international human rights law. Although the UN human rights system didn't initially adopt a proposed declaration on human rights and the environment, the UN Human Rights Council in the 21st century established a special procedures mandate on human rights and the environment, appointing an independent expert to assess environmental impacts on human rights and make environmental information public, to facilitate participation in environmental decision-making, and to provide access to remedies for environmental harm. In seeking international political recognition for human rights to prevent environmental harm, then UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment recommended in 2018 that the UN General Assembly recognize a right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Drawing on the work of the Special Rapporteur to clarify the normative content of this right, the Human Rights Council in 2001 unanimously recognized a right to a safe and healthy environment as essential for human life and dignity. And in 2002, the UN General Assembly formally recognized a right to a healthy environment under international law. And yet, despite these human rights foundations for a healthy environment, this framing of human rights and international climate agreements has only embraced the intersections between human rights and climate justice in the past decade. When the IPCC released its first assessment report on climate change in 1990, recognizing the magnitude of the threat and calling for immediate negotiations of an international agreement to stop global warming, it did not initially address either global health or human rights. Yet states responded by adopting the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which developed a general agreement to take measures to prepare for, to prevent, and to minimize these negative impacts of climate change. But neither the UNFCCC nor the Kyoto Protocol that followed and established measures to address climate emissions expressed a recognition of human rights. Yet advocates continue to rally for human rights in the conferences of the parties, raising human rights obligations in the lead up to the adoption of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. And under the Paris Climate Agreement, states committed to keeping global average temperature increases below 2 degrees from pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. WHO, for the first time, was able to find a place in these climate change debates by recognizing the health implications of climate change, with the WHO Director General describing the Paris Agreement as potentially the strongest health agreement of this century, as the Paris Declaration framed climate change as a threat to both global health and human rights, and included the right to health at the center of the climate change response. WHO would look to the Paris Declaration to develop collaborations between health and environmental ministers, and ensure that funds would be used to support countries in health adaptation, recognizing the catastrophic impacts of a changing climate on health and human rights. These human rights obligations to provide a foundation would support governments in responding to climate change, mitigating the health threats, and adapting through health systems. In focusing on mitigation, we would see governments seeking to reduce emissions, to avoid temperature increases, and the health impacts that arise from them, with UN human rights treaty bodies issuing an unprecedented joint statement on human rights and climate change, calling on states to consider their human rights obligations in the climate change response, and arguing that failure to take measures to prevent the foreseeable human rights harms caused by climate change, or to regulate activities contributing to such harms, could constitute a violation of states' human rights obligations. Human rights can create an imperative for governments to pursue mitigation efforts to prevent the effects of climate change on a wide array of health-related human rights. But these violations will occur, and human rights is thus sought to provide a corresponding basis to respond through adaptation, requiring that governments develop sustainable and resilient health systems to maintain essential functions and provide care. To create these climate-resilient health systems, governments will need to train health workers in linking climate change to health, will need to manage the health risks related to climate change, and will need to ensure that health systems are themselves climate resilient. With climate change posing an existential threat to global health, human rights provide a basis for climate change mitigation and adaptation, and a basis to hold states accountable for pursuing these actions. But this will require a reframing of human rights to reflect the rising challenges ahead. And in responding to these challenges, we need to ask, can human rights provide a path to motivate governments to address climate change toward a healthier environment and a sustainable planet upon which humanity can survive? Young people have launched widespread protests and national human rights litigation throughout the world to demand a policy response to a changing climate. But in facilitating accountability for climate action, climate change poses unique challenges for the traditional human rights regime in identifying appropriate rights holders and corresponding duty bearers, in shifting to international accountability through the International Court of Justice. As Alexandra Phelan will discuss today, an advisory opinion is being sought on behalf of the rights of island nations and future generations, providing legal standing for those who will suffer these harms in the future, and establishing common but differentiated responsibilities for the collective harms for multiple countries. These efforts to reframe human rights expanding traditional definitions of individual rights holders and state duty bearers, highlight the potential of human rights to address the global health impacts of climate change. But this will require us to reframe the harm itself. And we look to these harms on this panel through a focus first on One Health, with Laura Ferguson examining the inextricable linkages between human, animal, and ecosystem health, and the ways in which this has raised an imperative for multi-sectoral global collaboration across the World Health Organization, the World Organization of Animal Health, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and the UN Environmental Program. But some have questioned whether we need to look even more expansively at planetary health, with a new field of inquiry and social movement in planetary health emerging to address threats to human health and natural systems. Planetary health, as Kent Buse will explain, is grounded in the understanding that the achievement of the highest attainable standard of health is dependent upon a natural environment, recognizing that we need to conserve, sustain, and make resilient the planetary and human systems upon which health depends by giving priority to the well-being of all. We are bound together on this planet, and yet the climate crisis has posed an existential threat to the health and human rights of us all. In sharing how we can respond, we'll begin today by discussing human rights in One Health, as I mentioned, hearing from Laura Ferguson, an associate professor of population and public health sciences at the University of Southern California, the director of the program on global health and human rights, and the director of research at the USC Institute on Inequities in Global Health. Expanding from One Health to planetary health, we bring into the conversation Kent Buse, who directs the Healthier Societies program at the George Institute for Global Health and co-directs Global Health 50/50. And as we seek to facilitate accountability for these threats to global health, to One Health, to planetary health, we'll examine an opinion being considered by the International Court of Justice, ending with Alexandra Phelan, an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. With time running short in this conference for this world, can human rights provide a framework to hold ourselves responsible for the climate crisis and to take action to mitigate and adapt to this cataclysmic health challenge? Laura, I turn to you to begin our conversation on the challenges ahead and provide some hope on the final day of the conference.
Thanks, Ben. I'm not sure I'm going to answer that question, actually, of quite how we're going to fix all of this, but I will do my best. Can I have the? Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for hanging in there on the last day of the conference. It's great to see so many people here for what I think is a really important session, and thanks to Ben for organizing this and pulling together this panel of people. Also, thanks for kind of setting the global scene. It means I don't have to do that so much, which is really helpful. So what I'm going to do, as Ben said, I'm going to talk about One Health and how that's linked to climate change and human rights. And here's just a little overview of how I'll spend the next 10 to 15 minutes, really looking at what is One Health, what are the links with climate change, why are rights relevant, and then how do we think about using rights constructively in national responses. And so I think we need to remember that it's very useful to have simultaneously a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. So what Ben has been talking about is what's been happening at the global level. Like, how has the international human rights framework been evolving around these issues? And so I want to now kind of zoom in and look at one practical example of One Health and how that's playing out in a project in Uganda. And then at the end, I'll try and zoom back out to bring that back to the global level. So let me start just with the basics, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's important that we understand what One Health is and how it's different from global health. And I think its sort of defining feature is the integration of the health of people, animals, and the environment, and recognizing the interdependence of all of these, that we cannot achieve human health unless we have healthy animals, unless we have a healthy environment. And in order to achieve that, we need to be working across sectors, across disciplines, and of course, as always, we need to be putting communities at the center and having them drive some of this work. So the main sectors involved in One Health tend to be public health, veterinary sciences, public health again, apparently, because I'm a public health person, so I felt the need to put it there twice, and the environmental sectors. And obviously all of this, in my mind, is relevant to all of health, but with particular relevance for food and water, for nutrition, the control of zoonoses, so the transmission of diseases between humans and animals, pollution, and of course, combating antimicrobial resistance, which we all know is an increasing issue. I don't really need to explain climate change, but just to try and make some of the links with One Health, things like changing rainfall patterns that we know are occurring everywhere are changing vector patterns, so changing disease patterns and who is becoming infected with what diseases and where. We're seeing really important changes in agriculture, changes to crop yields, which are contributing to malnutrition, to loss of livelihoods, and much more. So all of these things that I have listed here, environmental degradation, deforestation, changing food systems, these all are relevant to One Health and many driven by climate change, amongst other things. So how do rights come in? I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing on the international human rights framework because Ben has done a lovely job of that already. I just wanted to flag this tiny piece of it again to show that what we're talking about has a legal underpinning in international human rights law. So whether that's the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which commits member states to granting humans a huge range of legal rights, including the rights to education, health, and an adequate standard of living. We also have the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment that Ben has talked about. So there's definitely stuff there in these international agreements that we can work with. The other really important thing that I think the human rights framework brings is the need for a multi-sectoral response. Human rights are known to be indivisible and interdependent. We cannot realize one right without realizing all the others, right? So when we're thinking about the interdependence of human, animal, and environmental health, we really need to be looking across all the different sectors to realize the very wide range of rights that underpins all of these issues. So there are many ways to research rights, not putting this out as the only one, but it is an approach that we used in this work that I'm about to describe in Uganda, and I think it can be applied in many other ways as well. One of the first things that looking at rights sort of requires is looking at a national legal and policy environment and seeing the extent to which international human rights obligations have been incorporated into laws and policies at the national level. That provides a national level accountability framework for fulfilling these rights. But that's not enough, right? We all know that what exists on paper and what actually happens in the world is really different. So we need to also look at how laws and policies are being implemented. Is there a budget attached? What are the governance structures? What training has taken place to enable people to fulfill the mandate that they've been given? All of these things and many more. And ultimately what we care about is people's enjoyment of the rights. So how are communities experiencing all of these rights at the ground level? And so that's really some of the things that we've been trying to get at in this work. So just a little bit now on the project itself, and it's just one example project. We're working in Uganda in what is called the cattle corridor, which kind of runs through the middle of the country. And we're studying Rift Valley fever, Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, and brucellosis. I have to say, I am a public health person, not a vet. I know nothing about any of these diseases, but it doesn't matter. What I'm trying to understand is the interactions between humans, animals, and the environment that shape exposure to these risks, so that can help us figure out how best to respond. And just to flag that this is a huge consortium that we have that I think is important because it is very multi-sectoral, and it includes government and communities. And so in many ways, I think it provides a useful model for thinking about how this work can be done. So this text is all taken from the Ugandan Constitution. I'm not going to read it all, but I promised you that it was important to look at laws and policies on paper, and the Constitution being the guiding law in the country. I wanted just to pull out, again, some of the really useful clauses that exist to help underpin this work. And you can just see that the Constitution obliges the state to help ensure the provision of basic medical services, to protect important natural resources, to promote sustainable development, and to fulfill the fundamental rights to social justice and economic development. And that includes social and cultural well-being, but also access to education, health services, water, work, decent shelter, adequate clothing, food, security, pension, and retirement benefits, right? This is all-encompassing. So this is a really strong legal provision about what the state has committed itself to with regard to the Ugandan people. All very positive. So then I zoomed in a little bit and we looked at the legal and policy environment specific to One Health. And here are the most relevant laws and policies that we found. The Uganda Public Health Act, dated 1962, unamended since then. The Animal Diseases Act, which was partially revised in 2006. The most recent is the Climate Change Act that was introduced in 2021 as a very positive development. There's also a climate change policy and a disaster preparedness and management policy, okay? What you may notice is that there is no One Health law or policy here, right? So there was a national One Health strategic plan. It expired last year, and it made reference to some of these laws and policies, but honestly, they're all a bit antiquated and piecemeal. So in terms of governing One Health, they're not particularly helpful. So what they found on the ground was that implementation of the strategic plan was limited by its lack of legal grounding because there was no explicit mandate for anyone to do anything. There was no budget allocation for anyone to do anything. So actually the plan on paper was lovely. It was really amazing, but nothing was filtering down to the ground level because of this lack of underpinning. One positive piece of news, I was in Uganda about a week ago, and they're just starting to draft a One Health policy, which I'm happy to go into a little bit more later on. So this is where things are at right now. But what's happening on the ground? Well, climate change is happening on the ground. So we're seeing changing crop yields, and we're seeing this as a threat to nutrition and livelihood. In some places, this is drought, and so people's crops are failing. In some places, like in the southwest, coffee is the cash crop. Too much rain is happening, so that's not good for coffee production. So livelihoods are under threat. And while we're talking about livelihoods, I have to also mention COVID. Much of the Ugandan economy is driven by tourism. So during the COVID pandemic, when tourism disappeared, there was a real crisis for people in terms of livelihoods, and that led to hunting and foraging because people had no other way to survive. And that really highlights to me the importance of this multi-sectorality. Unless people have a livelihood, we can't expect them to be protecting the environment and protecting animals, because it really becomes about survival. We're also seeing massive changes to vegetation throughout the country. And so what this means is that many wild animals are leaving their natural habitat because they can no longer get the nutrition that they need within those places. So they're coming out in search of food, and that's bringing them into contact with human populations and human diseases, right? So whether it's gorillas who are leaving the forest because they want to raid people's banana plantations, right, and then coming into contact with humans, whether it's elephants who are doing the same and, of course, causing huge destruction in villages. Even we see the big cats coming out to poach. So there's real danger here in zoonotic transmissions occurring. We're also seeing, as a result of these changing weather patterns, changing in cattle migration routes. And so as a result of that, we're seeing cattle and tick-borne diseases appearing in new places and, of course, new populations. So sometimes this is just shifting patterns to different human communities. Sometimes this is cattle being taken to graze into national parks, where they're then grazing with antelopes and buffaloes and providing all sorts of opportunities for cross-species transmission. Quick point that I think is really important is that exposures to zoonotic diseases or zoonotic threats arising from climate change are very gendered. And we've done a whole analysis in different parts of the country as to why women are more exposed to certain pathogens in some places and men are more exposed to other pathogens in other places. And we're not yet seeing that reflected in policy. And of course, we know that climate change displacement primarily affects indigenous groups. I'm not going to go into that for lack of time. So how can we use rights to make a difference? Again, there's a million ways of doing this. I'm just highlighting a few that we have used. So the first is we're supporting this creation of policy to operationalize international commitments. We're working very closely with the group who is driving the policy now, and part of this is based on the legal and policy analysis that we did, and that feels like a hugely important development. We are in this underscoring the need for intersectoral action, including plans, budgets, data systems. And I really want to flag challenges here because of the politics of this, right? We've talked a lot in this conference about the politics of global health. Well, they don't disappear when you go to One Health. In Uganda, the National One Health platform sits under the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Agriculture doesn't want to do what the Ministry of Health tells it to do, right? Understandably. And so we really need to think about governance structures in this. I want to focus for a minute on community engagement. I talked about livelihoods before. We need to have community engaged in protecting natural resources and seeing the value of those resources to their lives, and we've been doing some of that. And to also get community involved in the monitoring of health. So community health workers exist in many, many countries around the world. What we have done in Uganda is make them community health and conservation teams. They now also monitor symptoms of animal health, they monitor crop health, and there are reporting mechanisms that serve as an early warning system. And of course, we're trying to hold governments to account. This is the least developed aspect of the work. Ben talked about the international community and mechanisms for doing that. Civil society also has a role to play. And I really just need to flag also the private sector, because when we think about industrial agriculture and all of these massive industries that affect climate change and One Health, there's a huge role for regulation of the private sector. So just to finish off, I wanted to zoom out and just flag that these same challenges that we're seeing in communities and at national level in Uganda are also faced at the global level when we're thinking about governance for One Health, right? Who should lead on climate change and One Health, right? We're talking a lot about WHO, but it's not only WHO who's relevant here. So we have what's called the quadripartite, which is these 4 agencies who've come together to lead on One Health. It's WHO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the UN Environment Programme, and the World Organization for Animal Health. But what about others? What about UNDP, right? how is the quadripartite going to function? How does WHO's work fit within that? And how are these structures going to cascade down from the global to the local? And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much indeed.
Good morning. Great to see you all here on a Sunday morning. Ben, thanks for convening the panel. Also want to thank the consortium for this particular panel on climate and human rights, and also to recognize, obviously, one of the organizers, Professor Sophia Gruskin, for her role in bringing human rights into this conference. It's timely, it's important. I'm going to be bringing a gender lens into the discussion, and thanks, Laura, for bringing up gender as well. And my name's Kent Buse. I'm with I'm wearing my Global Health 50/50 hat here today, not the hat maybe that Ben introduced me with, but I wanted to follow on from Ben in relation to framing, and the panel is about climate change, and I think framing's important, particularly in relation to discussion on human rights. And I think, as Ben actually said in his talk, we're talking about climate crisis, we're talking about climate breakdown, and hopefully talking about climate justice. I'm going to be talking about gender, and again, I think that we just had the International Women's Day 2 days ago, and there's a real danger of that day being co-opted by commercial and other interests to frame women's engagement in the social order of things in a particular way. And there's a risk similarly in relation to discussions around climate, and that we really need to be looking much deeper at the structural drivers of the order that we exist in, and to think of the patriarchal structures that that really determine the way that we as human beings either have rights or as rights holders, whether or not we're able to realize them, as Laura said, and also in terms of who are the duty bearers and what do they represent. And I noticed Ben's slide on the ICJ there. I don't know if you did, but they're all men. And these are the people that are determining what sort of justice is done to the planet, or justice is done around gender. So I hope they're all feminists sitting on that panel, but I sort of doubt they are. I'm going to bring a gender lens, as I said, to this discussion from the point of view of Global Health 50/50, which is itself an accountability mechanism. Both Ben and Laura mentioned the importance of accountability, the importance of moving on commitments to rights holders being able to hold duty bearers to account. And what Global Health 50/50 attempts to do is to provide some data to support that, that those words move from paper to practice, as it were. I'm going to broaden out the conversation as well from climate to planetary health, as Ben has mentioned, and Laura has mentioned and discussed sort of some of the differences. Planetary health encompasses or has a similar framework to One Health. In many respects, it's about the environmental systems upon which human survival and animal survival depend. And in the case of global health, Global Health 50/50, which hopefully will become apparent momentarily, that was, in a sense, a matter of convenience, that we wanted a larger sample of organizations that we could look at. If we kept it at climate, there's a smaller number of organizations working on climate than there are in planetary health, broadly defined. So just a couple of words on gender, and in fact, Laura mentioned that gender runs through these things, and Laura also mentioned something that I think is important for this conversation, that around the indivisibility of rights. And Ben outlined a series of rights that are relevant: right to healthy environment, and so on. And I think that in this conversation, the right to gender justice is important. And in fact, I think we do need to see it in terms of the indivisibility, that these power structures that we're talking about, they're interconnected in effect, and that we shouldn't be looking at these rights in isolation. And when we look at them, my main message is that we should adopt a gender lens when we do that. So that's my one takeaway message. So there's not much more to say about this, I don't think, on this slide, other than that the evidence suggests that and shouldn't be surprising, that men and women and diverse gendered populations experience planetary health risks in different ways by virtue of the jobs they do, the exposures and risk factors that they have, and that they therefore have other different outcomes. The relationship between gender and planetary health isn't so well understood empirically, just because there hasn't been a lot of research on it, and in part because people don't disaggregate their data, and so we simply don't know. So that's, there is an emerging literature, but it's really limited by the lack of data and the lack of people's imaginations when they're doing this research to think of the gendered nature of planetary health or climate crisis and change and breakdown. So just a couple of words on Global Health 50/50. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I suggested already that we're an entity that supports accountability for gender equality in global health. And what we do is we do an annual survey of approximately 200 organizations active in global health, and we scour their publicly available information across 10 variables to get a sense of their gender-related policies and practices. And we have broken those organizations into a set of sectors as you see them there. I don't know if it's come up much at this conference, but exactly what is global health is a little bit unclear. But this is our sample of organizations, and we took the 11 multilaterals that have some sort of a mandate for health, took a series of public-private partnerships, et cetera, faith-based. And when we look at them, a number of them are for-profit and a number of them are not-for-profit. And every year we also put out a special report. So we collect data on 10 variables. Every year we have an index, and then every year we have a special report. Last year we had one on sexual and reproductive health in the workplace in those 200 organizations across people's life course. This year we're going to launch a report on planetary health, and this is some preliminary analysis that I'm going to present to you. So of those 197 organizations that we looked at annually for this special report, what we're looking at is those organizations who do planetary health work. And we are looking at those organizations, or we included the organizations in our sample that do climate, One Health, environmental change and health. And we excluded those organizations who don't mention that kind of work, but mention the sustainability work that they're doing within their own organizations. So we didn't include organizations that report on their ESG, for example. These are organizations that do programmatic work on planetary health, broadly defined, and we ended up with 108 of them, and 97 were in the not-for-profit sector and 11 in the for-profit sector. And what we've done is we've analyzed those separately, because they look quite separate in terms of how they're operating in planetary health in relation to their gender work. So, as I mentioned, we looked to see whether or not they were active in planetary health, whether or not they make a commitment to gender equality in planetary health, and importantly, what they mean by that, whether or not they sex segregate their data. If they don't sex segregate their data, it's probably very difficult for them to understand which populations they're serving or who's at greater risk. And we looked at their diversity in board membership and in leadership more generally. So what we found was, and this is in the not-for-profit, is that 92% of them make a commitment to gender equality, but over a third of them do not report on what they mean by that. 26% of them, so a quarter of them, seek, when we look at the work, when we analyze the text around their work on planetary health and gender, we see that they are thinking about gender in a feminist way. They're looking at the structural issues to some extent, and they recognize gender equality as a prerequisite for their progress on planetary health. 37% of the organizations are gender specific in that they identify a particular population group that they think is at risk, or they identify a population group that they intend to serve through their work. And we've found across the 108 organizations that when they do that, they focus exclusively on women and girls. None of the 108 make any mention of any vulnerabilities that men might have that are distinct and separate, or populations of gender diverse communities. So here are two examples of, as I said, what we do is report back on what organizations put in the public domain. And here are two examples of what two organizations, how they describe their own work in this area, and how we've tried to make a distinction between gender transformative and gender specific. And when we're not casting any judgment here on MSI, we're simply pointing out the fact that most organizations that are doing in global health, that are doing planetary health, focus on women and not these other genders, or take a more structural approach to thinking about how gender equality and gender norms might need to change so that rights holders will be well served, or that we can hold the organizations to account. When we looked at the text of what organizations are doing around gender and planetary health, as I said, they focus on women. There's a tendency really to feminize the discourse. And by that, we mean that women are seen to be those responsible for resolving the problems of planetary health. And it's the same in terms of the racialization in a sense. We can talk a bit about that more on the panel, what I mean by that and what our findings are, and what some of the texts are that we're basing that on. When we looked at the disaggregation of data, this is what we found. We found that 4 in 5 of the organizations in relation to their planetary health work do not make a commitment to disaggregate their data, let alone disaggregate their data. So only 1 in 5 organizations makes a commitment to disaggregate their data by sex. They may or may not actually be doing that. And then another thing that we looked at was around who is the representation, who holds power, who holds influence. And I'm sorry, I'm just sort of struggling here with my notes. And we were pleasantly surprised, actually. So the last time we looked at the board membership across our sample of 200 organizations, we found that there was a distinct lack of parity in both the boards and the board chairs, with men overrepresented. So in this sample of 108, we were pleasantly surprised to see parity, particularly in the not-for-profit sector. And we just got this data last week, and we're not really clear if it represents something specific to this sample of 108, or if there's a broader trend, and we'll be able to report that next month, or if it says something about the organizations that are involved in planetary health in one way or another, if there's some sort of relationship between representation and leadership opportunities there or not. One of the striking findings here, I guess, is that the not-for-profit sector is doing a lot better than the private sector, and of course the private sector is the sector that holds power in most domains of our life, including over whether or not climate justice and planetary health will be achieved. So sort of maybe a mixed story, but I guess the other thing to say there is that it's important, and we're pleased. 51% is great, but it's just a starting point, isn't it? Getting women into positions of leadership. It's around fairness, but what we also need is systemic fairness. And so I think that we need certain kinds of women and men in those positions of power. So just to conclude, when organizations working on planetary health talk about gender, they focus on women and girls, risking perpetuating the feminization of responsibility discourse. And as I said, their activities are really around caregiving responsibilities, cooking, wash programs, and so on. And we also need to be thinking about who is doing the talk. And it looks like there's more women doing the talk at the top, and hopefully that holds true. And I guess from a rights point of view, my final point would be that we're far away from realizing the kind of rights in terms of the rights of women and men as duty holders and also as duty bearers in terms of equality around gender. Bless you. And Ben, thank you for your patience.
Wait for it to pop up on the screen down here. Whilst I do, thank you to CUGH and USC for today's panel, and to Ben, Laura and Kent for some wonderful talks so far. My name is Alexandra Phelan, and I'm an Associate Professor and Senior Scholar at the Johns Hopkins Centre for Health Security and Faculty Director of Policy at the Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health. Thank you. I'm also an international lawyer, and I want to share with you today a story about the power of advocacy for human rights, climate change, and health. Before I do, I'm going to share a little bit of a legal background. You may be familiar with the International Court of Justice, sometimes referred to as the World's Court. It was established in 1945 in the wake of World War II and is governed by a treaty known as the Statute of the ICJ, which sets out when the court may be approached to provide its insights. All UN member states became party to this treaty when they became members of the UN. And the statute provides that the ICJ has jurisdiction, that is the power to decide, over two types of issues. The first are contentious disputes between states on legal questions, and the second is what's known as an advisory opinion, which can be requested by the UN General Assembly or Security Council, as well as other UN organs and specialised agencies. The ICJ may give advisory opinions on any legal question at the request of whatever body may be authorised. So what bodies are authorised? Well, under the UN Charter, the UN General Assembly or the UN Security Council may request on any legal question, so it's quite a broad ambit. But then for other organs of the UN and specialised agencies, they can request advisory opinions on specifically legal questions that arise within the scope of their activities, which for the World Health Organization, for example, has resulted in advisory opinions not being given when deemed to be outside the scope of their activities. So now to our story. In 2019, a group of 27 law students from countries across the Pacific studying at the University of the South Pacific were asked by their professor to propose a progressive way to use international law to address climate change. They decided to champion an idea to get the International Court of Justice to issue an advisory opinion on the climate crisis. And from their law school classroom in Vanuatu, the students prepared a legal brief and shared it with the leaders of the 2019 Pacific Island Forum, an intergovernmental organisation of 18 countries from across the Blue Continent. They formed an advocacy group called Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, and with Vanuatu and other countries that subsequently supported, lobbied for the advisory opinion. And in 2023, it's made its way to the United Nations General Assembly. In an exceptional moment of consensus, the UNGA adopted Resolution 77-276, request for an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the obligations of states in respect of climate change. The request was formally submitted to the court, and proceedings have now begun, with states and relevant parties given until this month to submit briefs on the issue. So let's now look specifically at what the request covers. First, what are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases for states and for present and future generations? Then, what are the legal consequences under these obligations for states whereby their acts and omissions have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment with respect to, specifically, states, including small island developing states, and peoples and individuals of the present and future generations? The request also refers to a suite of international treaties that contain binding legal obligations on states, asking the court to have particular regard to these obligations when considering their advisory opinion. I'm going to presume, based on the talks today, but also on our own experiences now, understanding of the myriad ways that climate change impacts human health, from extreme weather events causing death, injuries and displacement, flooding and food and waterborne disease, wildfires causing loss of life, burns and air pollution, triggering respiratory and cardiovascular events, drought and nutrition loss, famine, to vector-borne diseases shifting their habitable ranges, along with increased risk of spillover of zoonotic diseases. The health impacts of climate change are indeed a public health emergency. But where do we find the clear legal obligations to address the health impacts of climate change? And one of the most promising pathways, as you may have guessed by now, is human rights. As has already been noted, the entire purpose of human rights is accountability. Investing obligations to act on climate change in human rights provides clear legal obligations to protect, for example, the right to health, which is recognised under both the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, as well as in the Paris Agreement, as has been noted. Under Article 12 of ICESCA, that international covenant I mentioned, we find the articulation of the right to health as a binding legal obligation on states, which expressly includes all aspects of environmental hygiene. In 2000, General Comment 14 on the interpretation of the right to health took this further, clearly stating that the right to health includes a right to a healthy environment. This was expanded upon in 2013, as Ben mentioned earlier, when the then UN independent expert John Knox noted that this contains both procedural obligations as well as substantive obligations. Ben mentioned the procedural obligations already, but looking at the substantive obligations, that includes adopting legal and institutional frameworks that protect against environmental harm, that interfere with the enjoyment of human rights, including harm caused by private actors, as well as, critically, obligations to ensure the protection of members of groups in vulnerable situations, including women, children and Indigenous peoples. Turning now to the Paris Agreement, the right to health is expressly referenced in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, providing that countries have to respect, promote and consider their respective obligations on human rights, including the right to health, as well as rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities and people in vulnerable situations, as well as the right to development, gender equality, empowerment of women and intergenerational equity. And this is an incredibly powerful statement to have in an international environmental treaty. And as has been noted, was described as potentially the strongest health agreement of this century. But the challenge with this is that this is preambular language, and as some of you may know, preambular language typically does not go to binding legal obligations. Rather, it provides persuasive interpretation in the obligations that exist in the rest of the agreement. And so we can see how this may be considered by the court in interpreting obligations, particularly looking at, say, the right to health and interpreting obligations under the Paris Agreement. So getting the court to consider a right to health approach will be essential to fully understand the scope of obligations under international law on states with respect to climate change. And it also provides that critical framework through which to examine the disproportionate impact of climate change on small island developing states and already vulnerable populations that have contributed at least to, but bear the greatest burden of climate change. And if the court does issue an advisory opinion, it unfortunately will not be legally binding upon states. However, it will carry significant legal and normative weight, influencing advocacy efforts and how states interpret their obligations under international law to address climate change. And so if the court doesn't adopt that advisory opinion, or it does and it interprets the obligations incredibly narrowly, thus failing to progress international law in this space, then we do have a bigger question. And that question is, what is the utility of our existing international law, which, like global health, has colonial origins, in realising equity between nations, human rights, and justice? This is a 2016 article that mapped sea level rises in the Solomon Islands. This research found that nearly a decade ago, the Solomon Islands had already lost 5 islands. I want to finish by quoting Cynthia Honiohi, president of the Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change group I referred to earlier, who is from the Solomon Islands. She says, "In the Pacific Islands, we contribute almost nothing to climate change, but we bear the brunt of it. In this crucial decade, the world needs transformational change that accelerates climate action. We need guidance, and there is no better than that from the world's highest court. Look at your home and imagine that it is disappearing underwater as mine is. Ask yourself what action that motivates you to take. Our world is an island, and it is drowning because of inaction." So we will see where things progress over the coming months and years ahead with the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion approach. But he's hoping that perhaps the hope that launched this action from the 27 students in their law school classroom finds a receptive forum. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to all of our presenters for your thoughtful and engaging presentations around local, national, and global movements, the ways in which human rights advancements under international law can fuel these movements to build a brighter future, and the accountability mechanisms that are necessary to ensure that governments meet their commitments. If you have questions for our panelists, please let me recommend that you form a line at the microphone and that you keep your questions short given the time. As people make their way to the microphones, I hope to open our discussion together by considering some of the foundational questions that brought our panelists together. Specifically, I'm hoping that we can begin to grapple, and maybe Alex, I'll start with you, to think about how human rights can bring a One Health and a planetary health perspective into both WHO governance and influence the forthcoming holding of the International Court of Justice.
Yes, so I'll address those in the 2 parts that you mentioned. The first part being WHO governance. And I looked to some of the reform processes that are happening at the moment. We have the development of a pandemic treaty and negotiations underway right now, as well as amendments to the international health regulations, 2 of the primary pieces of international law for global health security. But what we're seeing in the pandemic treaty is the broader incorporation of a One Health approach, which is incredibly promising. But we've lost what was in earlier drafts of the treaties, which included a planetary health approach. And so where once there was reference to biodiversity and deforestation as potential upstream drivers of pandemics, they've been subsumed under other provisions, and climate change as a term itself is removed, even though there is some reference to climatic drivers. So I think we're unfortunately not moving in the right direction in terms of a planetary health approach to looking at, say, pandemics, but health more broadly when it comes to the governance structures at this point in time in those major reforms. In relation to the second part is what can WHO be doing to progress action. You know, as I mentioned, the international organisations that are UN specialised agencies in particular may be permitted to submit briefs to the ICJ and to advisory opinions that are occurring. I think this is a really critical opportunity that the WHO should be embracing. You know, we are already in March and the end of the month is coming quickly, so there's not a huge amount of time. But I think there's an important normative statement for WHO to be saying we are going to be inputting on this particular advisory opinion. So I think that's probably the lead one. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like we have 4 questions at the microphone, so we'll take them all. If you want to address them to a specific individual or to the entire panel, please feel free to do so. 5 questions at the microphone. So we'll take all 5 of them and then we'll work our way through. And if there's another round, we will hopefully have time for that. So we'll start at the front and then work our way to the back.
Well, thank you very much. A question for whoever wants to answer. In one of the other panels, it was mentioned that the inclusion of climate refugees as a legally figure could be very helpful because that's one measure that could put pressure on developed countries to act because they will be forced to take, for example, people from the small islands as legitimate refugees. Do you think this has any chance of happening? Thank you.
Perfect. Jocelyn?
Thanks for the panel and your talks, which were wonderful. I was really interested to hear the ways that people acknowledge the importance of the private sector or commercial activity in this entire enterprise. And I wondered if you might be able to respond to a question about how the instruments you're describing as being potential levers for change can be utilized to either create action within the private sector or protect us all from private sector activity, and perhaps be able to tell us as individual public health professionals with interests and rights how we might be able to surface concerns about private sector activity in this area and move us more toward the climate justice you're asking of us.
And we'll turn to the back, and I think there are 3 people.
Hi, my question is for Laura in particular, and this applies more broadly, but I want to know in regard to your work in Uganda. In balancing human rights, how do you go about encouraging Ugandans to report in particular sick animals or agriculture when it comes at a great personal expense to them? For example, many diseases such as anthrax, etc., require the destruction of the herd or the crop.
Hi, my name is Sarima, and I'm from University of British Columbia. I want to, first of all, thank you for such great enlightening talks. And I have a comment and 2 questions. My first thought is about that humans have inhabited this planet very recently, and climate change has not happened for the first time in humanity. Climate change has been a primary driver for human and animal migration patterns for thousands of years. And this shifting patterns of migration is in some way a natural phenomena. So my thought and a question is, people have always adapted themselves in some way or the another. So what are some of the lessons we can learn from the past, from human and animal migration pattern that can possibly inform our future adaptation efforts for humans on this planet? And my second question is somewhat related to the person who asked the second question, that what are some of the ways in which we can de-incentivize private sectors for their actions, like farming of the livestock, in reducing their impact or footprint on this earth in regards to climate change, and what possible consequences or impact it would have on our food system. Thank you.
Hi, I thank the panel for this presentation. My name is Connor Von Kraut. I'm pursuing my MPH at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. This relates to the discussion yesterday on human rights in this room. If you are to massively improve global health through the lens of human rights, you boost life expectancy, you improve the working class, you massively boost the economies of low income, low middle income countries. To me, that seems like a massive, if not the largest threat to the countries that dominate the world's economies, specifically the United States. It then seems to me like the easiest and most detrimental thing to do is to specifically target, suppress, and undermine international human rights. And I'm curious if the panel would agree with that or add any context to that.
Thank you so much for all of your questions. Turning to the panel, I'll begin in the order that people presented.
Okay, thanks for all those questions. There's a lot there. I'm not going to try and answer all of it. I think, Jocelyn, to your question about how do we use the instruments that we have to either promote action by the private sector or perhaps curtail action by the private sector. I think this comes back to the issues around accountability and politics, right? And as Kent mentioned, there's so much power that lies in the private sector because of their financial power. And to be honest, it's really difficult in all countries to rein that in because so often it's the corporate sector who are propping up the government, who are making, or who should be making the regulations to curtail any harmful activities. So again, I think it's one of those things that has to come from community action and from international pressure at the same time. And so there's very little understanding in many places, and I don't say this about low middle income countries or low income communities, but everywhere, there's very little understanding about really how large scale corporate action affects individual health. And I think that raising community awareness around that and around any accountability mechanisms that exist, be they local, national, or global, is going to be a really important first step because governments do have commitments. When we talk about human rights, we're talking about respecting, protecting, and fulfilling. When we're talking about protecting human rights, that's a government obligation to protect third parties, such as the private sector, from negatively impacting our human rights. And so we need to figure out the accountability around that a little bit more. The question about incentivizing reporting of sick animals is very, very real. In many places I've seen financial incentives being provided because you're right that if somebody reports a sick animal and they know that the impact of that is going to be that their whole herd of livestock is destroyed, there goes their livelihood, right? And so that's a massive disincentive. In Uganda, they're not doing that right now, and so they're relying on kind of community action and trying to protect other people's herds and getting other people to support. So they're really trying to make kind of communal activity around this, and I'm not sure that it's working, and I think they need to still figure that out. And right now, to be honest, I think the reporting system, I think people are actually reporting, but I think the government response is still not sufficiently strong to make it sustainable. But it's certainly something that they're looking at. And then I felt, there was a question about shifting migration patterns and those being normal. Absolutely, they're normal, but not to the extent that we're seeing them now. The acceleration of change that we have seen in the last few decades is totally unprecedented. And so are there lessons we can learn? Yes, and I think some of them are being harnessed, particularly at the community level. But I think what we're dealing with is just on such a different scale that we need solutions that are on a different scale as well. So I'm going to stop there and let others take on some of the other questions. Thank you.
Yeah. So as I probably didn't say I'm not a legal or human rights scholar at the beginning. I'm a political economist. I'm going to pick up on the power and the question, really, the question that two of you had around the commercial determinants of health, and make 4 points. And the first one is, I think that it's great that you're here. I think that public health and global health has marginalized rights-based approaches, and it's marginalized the upstream and commercial determinants of health as a field, much to its detriment in relation to health equity, be they climate migrants or workers in low-income countries, or even workers in the gig economy here in Los Angeles, or the people on the streets that we walked past this morning. So I think the first thing that we can all do is spend a lot more time advocating for the field of the social and the commercial determinants of health, in terms of funding, but also in terms of attention, and that includes for me these structural things is around rights. I think then in doing so, hopefully we'll be able to get a better understanding as a community of how these rights instruments work and what their potential is, and therefore how they can be utilized to make progress. But I do think that underinvestment really holds us back. We lack some understanding as a community about how to leverage them, how to put our power or our weight behind them. The third thing really is, I think that as a society, not just as a public health community, we need to think a bit more about what's normal and what's acceptable. And the commercial sector spends a lot of resources in a sense, what is considered the third phase of power. And if the first phase of power is having the influence and power to put something on the agenda, the second phase of power being the power, the influence to keep an issue off the agenda, like human rights. The third phase of power is to be able to get inside our heads, much as the advertising community or the sector gets inside our head, to get us conditioned in a way to think that large corporations getting away with destroying the planet is okay. It's normal. It's what they do. And so I think that spending a bit more time questioning the framing that we see around us, and questioning things like my understanding on just on those first two words on that slide right now, climate change, is that the commercial sector, the fossil fuel industry, to be specific, spent a lot of money on focus groups discussions to find out what would be the term that would lead to the most apathy around the planet, and they've came up with climate change as something that would put us all to sleep. It's a long wave event. It's not urgent. And so just saying it like it is, trying to reclaim the narrative. And then my fourth point around that reclaiming of the narrative, and kudos to the students of Vanuatu, creating a bottom-up demand for change. And kudos to the professor for setting that assignment. What a wonderful thing, and look where it's led to. So my fourth point, though, less glibly, is around us as a public health, global health community, joining forces with those constituencies in the climate crisis movement to create the bottom-up demands that I think both of you referred to hold the corporate sector to account. So I'm only going to deal with that question because that's the only one I'm qualified to say anything about in a meaningful way.
So I'm going to silo myself and put all my responses through the international and legal angle. So referring to that, the first question, thank you very much for that. I think one thing that is going to come out of this advisory opinion, if it goes ahead, is thinking about what common but differentiated responsibilities really means in practice. How do you have both minimum standards when we require collective collective action, but also recognising the inherent injustice in the burdens and contributions to climate change. So I think we might see a progressive development of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in that sense that would be very, I think, very useful and applicable, hopefully, beyond international environmental law and potentially towards global health as well, which has similar colonial histories and a different similar dynamic when it comes to who is contributing to and being burdened by the impacts of global health threats. On the private sector, I want to pick up at the point that Laura mentioned about respect, protect and fulfill, and just give you a snapshot of how you can take that and put it into text and into legal obligations. The most recent draft of the Pandemic Treaty was released on Friday, and in it we have a line about respecting human rights and the right to health as a guiding principle. And that's wonderful to get that express reference, but it's missing protect and fulfill. And that lack of protect critically means that there isn't an obligation on states in the treaty, there is from human rights law angle, but in the treaty to hold third parties accountable. And that's something that I think as a clear advocacy line that we can do over the next 6 weeks is pushing to get protect back into the language of the treaty. Similarly, there's a mechanism known as the PABS, Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System, that's being established by the treaty. I won't get too into the weeds with it, but it's an example of a mechanism that seeks to engage industry and tie industry into legal obligations rather than just simply leaving international law as purely between states. I think this kind of idea of legal mechanisms that think about things differently ties into the question about migration patterns as well. And I echo the comments that Laura made there about the scale of this crisis. And I think flipping it on its head a little bit, what the scale of this crisis means is we actually can't adapt to everything. There are impacts that are being felt now that are no longer adaptable. They are well beyond the scale of adaptation. And that's where mechanisms like the loss and damage mechanism that is being developed through the climate law space seeks to provide compensation or some form of equity and justice for countries that are bearing the brunt of these unmitigable or unadaptable damage from climate change. And finally, there was the final comment question about perhaps the perverse incentive to suppress and undermine human rights. I think where we see that perverse incentive play out is actually at the in-between states, the international level, not necessarily on the human rights level. And part of the reason I think is it's about power dynamics and who is the duty bearer that Ken referred to before. The duty bearer is the state to individuals and peoples, and I think that's a pressure that is perhaps at the international community level one that is happy to be sustained. Where we see this playing out is in the dynamics between states about equity. We're seeing it in provisions about equity in the Pandemic Treaty being weakened or watered down. We're seeing it in other ICJ cases that we've been watching over the past weeks. We're seeing it in the shift to a multipolar world. I think that, and particularly around the decolonisation movement, is where we're seeing the pressure from high-income countries in the global north resisting, rather than necessarily at the individual human rights level. I think the dynamics for suppression of human rights is coming from a slightly different place in that respect. But thank you very much.
And so the world hangs in the balance of policy reforms that will take place in the coming years. And as Kent said, the most hopeful thing at this moment is that you are all here. While humanity has long experienced and adapted to shifts in the Earth's climate, Laura notes that global industrialization, corporate action, has driven unprecedented anthropogenic climate change. And Alex has presented 2 paths to challenge this injustice through the International Court of Justice and to protect public health under a pandemic agreement. Much more will be needed, and we're literally looking to the next generation as our last best hope to address these unprecedented harms. We have just a little bit more time. We have 2 more questions that have arisen, so we will take those, do another round, and then come together and close. It is not, but we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much to all the panelists today. My name is Jacob, and I'm with the University of Southern California. I'm a PhD student in population health. and place. My question is probably will go to all the panelists. I often ponder about climate change, epidemics, and human rights. And just want to hear your views about some lessons that we can learn from COVID-19 pandemic and human rights, because a lot of talks were out there related to COVID-19 pandemic and human rights. So what lessons can we learn from that going forward? Because I think we all know that climate change is a serious threat to the risk of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. So what does that mean to, what lessons basically can we learn from the pandemic that we are just from, and then so that we can best prepare ourselves for future epidemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One last question.
This was a great panel and presentation. I learned a lot. My name is Jeff Wycliffe. I'm a professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham in the School of Public Health there. I'm an environmental health scientist with a rather long, interesting background that goes back to wildlife ecology. So I figured, hey, this is the last day. This is a good place to bring this up. I've been a One Health, advocate and champion and studying it for some time too. But because it was born out of public health and veterinary health, it's still very human-centric. So it's more about, let's make sure they're healthy over there so we're healthy. And this is probably really philosophical since we can't get human health right and human rights right. But, should, and this is really to Dr. Ferguson, but maybe the others too in their capacity could think about this. But at what point do we start to think about animal rights here and the rights of these animal populations that we talk about in One Health that come in contact with us? And I think your example in Uganda where you mentioned, and I don't realize this is very complicated, but where there have been problems and droughts, and they have to move on to some of the parklands where, those are protected habitats for non-domestic, non-agricultural animals. But they come into contact, obviously, with those wild animals. And so the interplay between that would be the economic impact in Uganda of impacting those native animal populations. So ecotourism may be affected by that. So I'm just kind of turning that around on its head a little bit and just asking Dr. Ferguson, what do you think? Should this be part of the conversation now, or is it something because we can't get human rights right, that we just kick it down the road and don't worry about it until we've got more of this right, and then we can come back to it? Just a thought.
Great, thank you. Let me start with Jacob. Thanks for the question. What lessons can we learn from COVID about human rights? I think we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to keep it brief. I think we learned that medical advances and scientific advances are really critical in fighting pandemics, but that unless we're dealing with society and community and inequalities and making sure that everybody has a basic minimum, we're not going to win. And I think the lack of solidarity that we saw during the COVID pandemic was a real sort of alarm bell for many of us, that even when we have the medical advances, which I don't want to belittle, they were phenomenal, we still didn't get it right because we're not paying attention to the inequalities that exist between and within countries, and that we really need to be looking at those basic societal structures in order to be prepared for the next pandemic, because we need people to be holding together much more than we did during COVID. And then for the question about sort of One Health being disproportionately focused on human health and human rights, listen, I think your example about ecotourism is actually about human rights, because when communities know that they rely on the natural environment and these animals to support their own income, they also want to protect the park. And so that was why I spoke a little bit about involving communities in wildlife endeavors, in protecting the environment, because once they understand how interconnected that is with their own livelihood and their own health, they're much more invested in that as well. I think the challenge that we face, that we'll always face, is when the immediate need is, how do I put food on the table for my family tonight? And that comes back to the same point. We need the basic livelihoods. We need a basic standard of living available to everyone, which brings us back to human rights and their indivisibility and why we need to focus there. Thank you.
I do realize that we're pretty much out of time, so just 2 points, again, reinforcing points I made earlier. I think that in relation to COVID, if there was a lesson there, that people affected need to be involved in decision making in good public health, and we need to reclaim that kind of public health. And so we need more democratic governance, and therefore we need the right kinds of people represented in those governance structures. And so, wearing my GH 50/50 hat, we need more equitable opportunities for leadership for everybody in the world. And then secondly, I mean, because what we saw in COVID was there wasn't much diversity in those national task forces, and hence all the policies were gender blind. I think that came up in the panel earlier. And then secondly, we need, and it's related to this, it's the flip side of the coin, we need better systems of independent accountability, and we need to back those up with human rights related kinds of sanctions. And we need the human rights people to speak a bit more plain English. For people like me. Thank you.
I want to say something a little controversial, and that is one thing we've been hearing a lot over the last 5 years is how a health framing of climate change really motivates people for action. And I think we need to look at COVID-19 and realise that a health framing may motivate people at an individual level, but when it comes to collective action or what the government and what people are requesting of their government, it's not going to motivate action in that sense. So I think we need to think about the way vaccines are the same as solar panels, that technologies in terms of access to technology, the technology transfer, equitable access to climate change technologies are going to face the exact same types of barriers of nationalism, intellectual property that we saw with vaccines, diagnostics and therapeutics, and be preempting that in the way we start our response. And on the last one, I actually had a past hat where I served as a lawyer for a number of dogs in animal rights cases in Australia. And I think that the animal rights and thinking about animal rights movement is really growing and developing, and thinking about how it's actually solidified into law and legislation, perhaps not in the traditional ways we see rights-based expressions. We also have the same movement happening for the rights of nature and recognition of personhood or standing for rivers and for different environmental features. I think that's where, for me, planetary health has become the framework through which I operate, because it embeds an equity and rights-based approach that I feel is less anthropocentric than perhaps human rights or other models that we've done historically. So, yeah.
And so I'll keep it short and keep it simple. As we near the end of the conference, thank you so much for attending this session on climate change as a threat to global health and human rights. These are complex threats that demand complex responses, but I hope that these legal discourses will be helpful as your global health work expands in the years to come, to address the complexity of the climate crisis and to advance a human right to a healthy environment. We are at a crossroads for global health, for human rights, for global governance, but I hope that our field of global health can engage with many of the law reforms that are taking place in the coming months, that we can recognize the ways in which the earth hangs in the balance, that we can think about how the electoral process that is taking place in many countries throughout the world, and the policy reforms that will result from that will determine the future of global health and human rights. And I hope that we can continue to focus on this existential threat through all of the disciplines that need to be brought together in order to address this unprecedented crisis. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to our panelists, and enjoy the last day of the CUGH conference.